States. And how does that play out in an age of populism? How does an established institution make a difference in an era of deep institutional mistrust? And there's some truth to the critique.
A good compromise is everyone leaves a little bit unhappy, right? But I think what's going to happen is that after market structure passes, the banks are going to get fully into the crypto industry. So we're not going to have a separate banking industry and crypto industry. It's going to be one digital assets industry. And I think
and will they be
tokenization, decimalization is necessary. It's ironic that we see two emerging countries leading the world in decimalization, in the tokenization and digitization of their currency.
So you heard it there. 3 different statements, all talking about something very similar. They're talking about control and digitalizing their currencies. Now, these are all from the World Economic Forum going on right now in Davos, where we have the CEO of BlackRock, who now manages $14 trillion worth of assets, talking about losing control and how everybody's going to move into tokenization. And David Sachs, the crypto czar of the United States, now saying that banks are going to essentially bend the knee and converge with these crypto tokens. Now, this is where I think it is very interesting, because everyone in these heard these clips, thought that this is extremely bullish. Adoption is coming, right? Bitcoin is winning. But when you understand that these 3 statements actually mean how they connect to each other, you realize that Bitcoin isn't actually winning, that the elites are trying to capture Bitcoin, and the plan is already in motion. So let me show you exactly what's happening. First, let's look at what lost control already means, right? Because BlackRock and what they are looking at here at the World Economic Forum, they're all looking at essentially how these people are playing out, right? How these elites are controlling the money system, right? Because at the end of this stream, you're going to understand why this isn't about Bitcoin adoption. It's more about capturing the crypto market. So when we look at how this is going, right? The Davos, the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, this is where the global elite meet every single year, right? We have Lagarde there. We have central bankers, billionaires. And this year, crypto was a major topic. In fact, it was one of the biggest headlines, right? The digital economy. Where is that going to be going from here, right? So now when you look at how essentially the WEF is looking at crypto or digital assets, they're not talking about, all right, should we ban it? Is it a threat? They're talking about integrating digital assets into traditional finance, the future of regulated information, public-private partnerships in blockchain. So look at that language there. It's integrated, regulated partnerships. That's not, we hate crypto. That's how are we going to absorb it, right? And I hate using the word crypto, but at the end, these all of these people essentially look at Bitcoin in the same way that they look at crypto, at least unfortunately right now. So the first clip, Larry Fink was saying the global elites have lost control, right? That was essentially the whole premise of this, because they're bending the knee, right? This is a guy that manages $14 trillion, and he's saying that the elites have lost control. And you got to ask yourself, all right, control of what when they say that, right? But for decades, the global financial elites captured capital flows through a very simple system. You want to store wealth, you use a bank. You want to invest, you use a brokerage or an asset manager like BlackRock. You want to move money internationally, you use SWIFT banking systems, right? So every single transaction, every dollar, every single asset, it flowed through their infrastructure. Now they took cut every layer. And now what are they worried about? Well, Bitcoin has essentially showed up and taken a piece of that pie. This is their major moneymaker that they had, for times before. So people are starting to move their wealth outside of the traditional financial system. And for somebody like Larry Fink, who's literally their entire business model is on taking a little piece of the pie here and there when you're moving money, well, that's an extreme threat. But here's the thing that Larry Fink isn't saying at Davos, because, even though he's complaining about losing control, they're looking at how to get it back. And that's the biggest thing, right? Because the next two clips that I showed you guys on the David Sachs banking, that's essentially how they get back control, right? Trump's crypto czar, David Sachs, he's essentially come out and said, okay, well, instead of banking, or instead of just traditional banks, David Sachs, the White House and AI crypto czar, said that banks are going to embrace crypto. And now everyone in crypto heard. And they got excited. Oh, finally, the banks are adopting, right? This is going to be a good thing. But if you take a step back and look, the banks adopting, that actually means that they just want that control back, right? The banks will let you custody your own Bitcoin. Yeah, sure they will, right? Banks will support peer-to-peer transactions. Yeah, sure they will, right? Banks will give up their role as middlemen. Yeah, sure they will, right? What he means is banks will integrate crypto into their existing infrastructure. And we're already starting to see this, right? With, JPM coin and other things that have been rolled out here since the institutionalized of, blockchain, let's say, right? Because JPM coin is created by Jamie Dimon, who has essentially been, Bitcoin's biggest hater, for lack of a better term. But, when it comes down to it, if you want to buy Bitcoin, you essentially have a few options now, right? You could buy it on an exchange like Coinbase and then withdraw it to your own wallet, where allegedly you control it. You could buy it peer-to-peer, or you can mine it yourself. But if banks embrace it, here's what happens. You go to JP Morgan, you say, I want Bitcoin exposure. They'll say, great, we offer a Bitcoin custody product. We'll hold it for you. It's insured, it's regulated, it's safe. And you say, but can I withdraw to my own wallet? And they'll say no, because for regulatory and security reasons, right? That's kind of what these guys are all about. So banks embracing the quote unquote crypto industry is not a positive, right? Because it means Bitcoin gets absorbed into that traditional banking system, and where you need their permission to access it. So David Sachs, as the White House crypto czar, is essentially going to create the regulatory framework to make that happen. Not because he hates Bitcoin, but because this is the compromise between ban it and let it run free. The compromise will allow it essentially to go through those regulated gatekeepers. And who are those gatekeepers going to be, right? It's essentially banks, BlackRock, and Coinbase, which brings us into the third clip that I showed you guys about Larry Fink essentially saying that everything is going to be tokenized, right? Because let's just face it, right? They're looking to tokenize everything, where that sounds okay, bullish. Tokenization means putting real world assets on the blockchain, right? Stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, everything. Having a fully open ledger, allegedly, right? Like, this would be somewhat bullish. But once everyone thinks this is the future, everything's on a blockchain, the decentralization would win. They'll ask you the question, who is going to be the one tokenizing all of this, right? Because here's the thing, tokenization requires a legal authority, at least right now. So you can't tokenize Apple stock. Apple has to authorize it. And the SEC has to approve it, and somebody has to have custody of that underlying asset. And you can't just tokenize a building. There's the deed, the title, the legal owner, all that kind of jazz, right? So when Larry Fink says everything will be tokenized, what he's really saying is BlackRock will tokenize everything, right? I mean, we saw it before when Larry Fink was initially, applying for that Bitcoin ETF. Well, we saw one of two things right off the jump. We saw the Bitcoin ETF had been applied for decades before. Nobody was essentially embracing it. Then all of a sudden, after that, we saw the BlackRock or the Bitcoin ETFs immediately get approved. Well, that seems extremely bullish for everybody involved, but that essentially meant the biggest money manager was essentially just to throw it around and just essentially say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is why, this is essentially how the world works to a lesser extent. These guys essentially just let everybody know that, hey, we're the biggest horse in town. So with BlackRock continuing to go and looking at this, right, they're working on it. They're working on bringing traditional finance onto the blockchain. That's their cool, I guess, thing, right? And then they've already got the BlackRock iShares Bitcoin ETF. So when they're looking at how to build this digital economy, right, with BlackRock, Larry Fink, he's at a co-chair at the WEF now, right? So when you look at what the WEF is saying, it's essentially like BlackRock's plan being lined out. And BlackRock has the most assets under management of any single, asset manager on the planet. So he's essentially the most powerful guy. He's got the WEF chair behind him, and he's got, he's got the biggest Bitcoin ETF, and then he's got all these other tokenization things coming on board. And it's just massive for him, right? Like, he's essentially seeing this as a huge money manager, huge money maker. And so when he keeps opening his mouth at these things, we got to listen, because they're not essentially looking for decentralization. They're looking for to integrate the financial system using the blockchain, right? They don't, Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan looked at MicroStrategy buying a bunch of Bitcoin. They had that coordinated attack that I made some videos on earlier. And if you guys watch that, make sure you're subscribed. But, they're essentially trying to build a safeguard for all of this, right? Because if you look at the connection between this and then now the connection between Coinbase, that's where things get really interesting. And I'm going to get into all of that here in a second. But, when you're hearing all this stuff, folks, and you want to get to your freedom technology, you do not want to be selling your Bitcoin. So the best place to borrow against and unlock your liquidity is Salt Lending. You go to saltlending.com/green-candle or the link in the show notes, and they're going to give you an exclusive deal for Bitcoin listeners, or for Green Candle listeners, excuse me. They're going to give you 50 basis points off with a term duration of 1, 3, or 5 years and 70% LTV. That's some of the best rates that you guys can get anywhere. So I highly recommend them, because they are just absolutely crushing it, trying to give you guys a bunch of new offerings. But let's just face it, folks, right? Brian Armstrong, you guys, I dropped a video all on this yesterday. I went over it on a little bit on my live stream, but Brian Armstrong, he's one to not really be trusted in this industry, folks, because he's done some sketchy things, to say the very least, right? So if you look at this, essentially, let's look at the connection, right? Larry Fink is saying the elites lost control. Why? Because Bitcoin and crypto let people opt out of the traditional financial system. The next is banks will embrace crypto. How? Well, by integrating crypto into the existing infrastructure. The third was everything will be tokenized. But they've lost control because Bitcoin has given people freedom. So in order to maintain and regain that control, they're going to make the banks the gatekeepers for crypto assets, right? So, Brian Armstrong allegedly has been fighting banks and all of this. But if you really take a step back and look at what he's been doing, well, it's actually pretty astonishing, because Coinbase has essentially been working closely with banks, right? And the banking committee. The Coinbase delay, right? That them kind of fighting all of these banking regulations is very interesting, right? So how are Larry Fink and the elites going to get back control? Well, they're going to absorb Coinbase, because blockchain doesn't disrupt BlackRock. BlackRock uses blockchain to maintain the control. And that's basically this whole entire thing here, because once we see Davos, right, start to come out, and we see who's all there, I mean, at the end of the day, we've got something weird going on here, right? Because Brian Armstrong has, come in and say, oh, we're taking Bermuda's economy on chain. This is how we're going to do it. And they've all got their weird pink ties together. But, multiple panels were talked about as like integrating crypto into the traditional financial system during this entire Davos meeting. And Brian Armstrong was at the center of it. And let's just face it, these are the elites who control the money printer. The closer you are to the money printer, the more successful you are. It's just, the reality of the world we live in, unfortunately, right now. So if this is the reality, and then Brian Armstrong is essentially getting as close as he possibly can to that money printer, you've got to ask yourself, all right, what the hell is going on? Why is Brian Armstrong there and embracing all these guys that are allegedly fighting him? Because the SEC has been suing Coinbase for years. They've had an ongoing case. But now Brian Armstrong's all buddy-buddy with these guys and saying, oh, we're going to embrace crypto. You know, it's this great thing. And then when you look at the Brian Armstrong's tweets of all of this and how he's essentially denying the Senate banking bill for these DeFi reasons, this is where it gets, you know, everybody's like scratching their head saying, okay, why are they doing this? Right? So, you know, the erosion of CFTC's authority. So the innovation is now shifted to the SEC. And then if you take a deep dive underneath the hood, you realize Coinbase has contributed the 8th most to politicians out of 40,000 companies. 8. Look, I mean, Brian Armstrong's built a great company, but if you look at, you know, the companies by market cap, right? Is Coinbase the 8th? What do you guys think in the chat? I'm curious. Coinbase is the 397th rank asset by market cap. So sure, they have 58.3 billion in their market cap, and then they're donating over, over 1% of that is just contributions, literally. Balance sheet, just contributions. And then if this goes, if you want to count this towards the lobbying as well, well, there are 162 out of 920 or 9,200 companies, which is still more than their market cap in overall rank. So essentially they're swinging well above their rank when it comes to the regulation. And you got to ask yourself, why are they doing that? That is, for some reason, they see some value in it, right? So Brian Armstrong wants you to think that Coinbase is fighting that system, when in reality, they're not. Because let's take a peek, right? Coinbase is custodying majority of these guys' Bitcoin, right? All, of these entities, these 364 entities, a lot of them are custodied by Coinbase. They're one of the few regulated Coinbase guys or regulated custodians that is essentially embracing this whole movement. So at the end of the day, when you keep looking and diving in, who owns majority of Coinbase? Well, BlackRock owns 7% of Coinbase, which is a majority shareholder, which essentially means that they're allowed to make some decisions here, right? So Coinbase diving in and doing all these things, at the end of the day, millions of dollars is lobbying for Congress, donating to politicians on both sides, and they have massive government affairs in Washington. So you don't spend millions of lobbying if you're fighting the system. You spend millions of lobbying if you're trying to, let's say, shape the system, right? So if they're regulated, it's like, by who? Brian Armstrong's like, oh, I support the concept of this bill. And then the bill gets taken back and he realizes he has a little bit more power because he's got money, right? At the end of the day, he's got the money. So if he delays or pulls Coinbase's support, well, that delays the movement at the end of the day, right? Money talks. So here's the part that nobody's talking about. This isn't Coinbase versus the banks. It's not BlackRock versus crypto. It's all of them working together. So they're doing the structure, right? BlackRock and Wall Street, the ETF, they're launching it. They're getting like tens of thousands, if not billions of assets under management every single day. And I mean, this thing, it's just growing, right? I mean, it's one of the biggest Bitcoin ETFs, the biggest, and they have a sponsorship fee of 0.25%. So these guys are, getting the control. Within a year, they custodied tens of thousands of Bitcoins on behalf of institutions, pension funds, endowments. BlackRock controls institutional access to Bitcoin. The next is the banks, right? The payment rails. You need bank account to get your dollars into Bitcoin, and you need a bank account to get dollars out. So banks partner with crypto companies and stable coins, right? So we've seen Circle, USDC, has partnered with some of these different guys, right? It relies on a regulated network of banking partners, with BlackRock managing a sufficient portion of it, right? So BlackRock owns a significant portion of Circle. And then who just had a Circle partnership? It's Coinbase, right? The Bermuda team, how they're taking the thing fully on chain is Coinbase bought out Circle. Circle's massively owned by BlackRock, and Coinbase is massively owned by BlackRock. At the end of the day, when you follow the trail here, it all leads back to BlackRock. These guys are all controlling the levers behind the scenes. And so Coinbase partnering big banks to power next gen crypto services. Oh, thank God for Coinbase. These guys are so great, right? That's what they want you to think at the end of the day, right? Like, this is something that's bullish. But at the end of the day, when you take a step back and look, it sketches you out a bit, right? Because we're seeing how Coinbase is just pulling Coinbase is essentially getting influenced, because BlackRock's got that institutional layer, the banks have the payment layer, and Coinbase has the retail layer. So they're not competing, they're dividing the market up, essentially setting up for this banking cartel. And so when Brian Armstrong lists the 4 major problems of the Senate banking bill, it's not because he's doing it for the goodness, out of the goodness of his heart. No. I don't believe that. He's doing it because these all hurt some sort of area that, he's breaking down, right? Or some sort of area that he is really starting to break down, right? So when you look at or some part of his business model, he's got a de facto ban on tokenized equities, right? Coinbase has actually already filed for this, so it hurts them, their next big revenue stream. So of course he would oppose this, right? The DeFi prohibitions, this would force DeFi platforms to collect KYC and report. It hurts all these others, and it actually does help Coinbase. But if DeFi is illegal, unless you're a centralized and regulated entity, then everyone has to use Coinbase. So Armstrong says he opposes this because it gives government access to your financial record, but Coinbase actually already does all this. So it's watch what you do. It's watch what they do, not what they say in this aspect. And then the third is the stablecoin reward restrictions. This is interesting because they're trying to get people to essentially hold more stablecoins with them, opposed to essentially, going to the bank, right? But this is where I already showed you guys this article here, right? Coinbase is trying to become a bank. They're really trying to embrace that aspect of it, right? So this means banks and Coinbase, they're both part of the same cartel. They're negotiating who gets which piece. And the last part that Brian Armstrong said was the CFTC authority erosion, right? This hurts everybody. So Armstrong is framing like this all bad for crypto, but he's really just negotiating at the end of the day, right? So taking this all full circle, Larry Fink saying the elites lost control, David Sachs saying the banks will embrace crypto, Larry Fink saying that everything will be tokenized. Essentially losing control. What are they doing? They're getting control by, getting guys like Brian Armstrong in their loop, right? And getting Brian Armstrong in with them and having him at Davos, right? This is where it gets a little hairy. This is why you need Bitcoin in self-custody. I've partnered with Trezor to give you guys the best option. You guys can go to the affiliate link down below. Please do that. Check them out. In 2026, we're getting our Bitcoin off exchanges. So please do that ASAP. Because I travel a lot, they've got a great feature where essentially, you can use Bluetooth or direct wire if you'd like to access your Bitcoin. So I highly recommend Trezor. And then lastly, you've got to back it up with something metal. So go to cryptosteel.com/greencandle. Use promo code greencandle and get 10% off your entire order. They've got a tamper seal, so make sure you do that. So nobody can access your Bitcoin, without knowing it, because Brian Armstrong and all these guys, they're coming for it, folks. USDC, they're pushing everything outside of Bitcoin. You got to ask yourself why they're doing that, right? I mean, they're in the same places with these guys that are essentially, creating the MiCA, the crypto asset regulation, right? All of these guys are essentially in one building talking about how can we regulate these guys more? How can we regulate the Bitcoin and crypto industry more? So if they're asking that question, folks, you've got to protect yourself by getting your Bitcoin off exchanges. And I'm going to be covering it all right here. I'm going to maybe do another video or something like that here in the next few minutes, but I'm on a trip to Bogota. So I will be flying this afternoon. So make sure you guys are smoking that like, hitting that subscribe button, telling a friend to tell a friend, and I'll catch you guys all at the next one.